The Quran was this most powerful revelation from Allah to the Muslims. And this Quran is of course the core of Islamic society. It was the fuel which drove Islamic civilization and drove the Muslims, whatever the Muslims did thereafter. It was the fuel behind their jihad. It was the fuel behind their society. It was the fuel which they, or the food from which they ate from, and from which they solved all of their problems. The Quran was the heart. It was the beating heart of Islamic civilization. And so of course, as you can imagine, that when the Muslims started to learn something, it was connected with the Quran always. So in fact, it's fair to say all of Islamic learning was really centered around the Quran, completely and utterly. And so the Muslims were always serving the Quran with their knowledge in any way that they felt they possibly could. So in the beginning, of course, we have the compilation of the Quran, which we'll discuss later in this term, how the Muslims strive hard to compile and preserve the actual content of the Quran. And then the Sahaba and the generations that followed them and the generation that followed them served the Quran with whatever they could. So you had some people devoting themselves to the tafsir of the Quran and to learning the hadith from the Prophet that related to the Quran. And they were teaching the tafsir of the Quran and what the Sahaba said about the Quran. Other of the early Muslims felt the need to document the Arabic language, because it's the language. Why? Because it's the language of the Quran, so it's also a Quranic science. And so what did they do? They wrote down dictionaries, and there's no civilization of the people who were given revealed books that were actually, their book was served like our Quran was served. And perhaps, if you look at the difference of characteristics, the other books were books that batil actually could come to them. And the reason for that, of course, they weren't sent to last forever, but the Quran was sent to last forever. And so the Quran has characteristics that other books weren't given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They weren't preserved in this way. They didn't have the same izzah, the same might, and the same power that batil couldn't touch it. And the other revelations didn't have some of these characteristics. And so the people didn't serve their books, but the Muslims had been given a revelation. Really, it was quite unlike any other revelation. And so they served it with might and main. And so we have dictionaries written in the very first century of the entire Arabic language. Why? To preserve the Quran, not for any other reason. And so no other book had this privilege, and that's why the other books, we don't know what some of what their words are. We have people preserving the grammar. Again, no revealed book and no language has really a preserved grammar from their own book, so they will know how the language works. For the Muslims in the very first century were spending might and main saying, what is Arabic grammar? Why? To preserve the Quran, of course, so we can understand the Quran in later generations. We had people in different centuries, and all manner of Quranic knowledges were preserved from point of view of hadith, from point of view of history, from point of view of how to recite the Quran, and the different ways to transmit the Quran, and the recording of the Quran, and scribes writing out the Quran, and people teaching the Quran to their kids, and the interpretation of the Quran, and how to derive law from the Quran, principles of how to interpret the Quran for law, how to derive belief from the Quran, and principles of how to approach the Quran to deduce belief. And so people serve the Quran across the Islamic world, from east to west and north to south, in different ways. And people wrote books on these different subjects. You might have a book on grammar in the Quran, a book on strange linguistic usages in the Quran, different books on different knowledges that pertain to the Quran. These are the knowledges of the Quran that the Muslims developed because of, why? Because of what we just mentioned right now. The Quran was so impressive, it was their book, and so the Muslims preserved the book. Or, from the flip point of view, Allah preserved His book through these people, because the book was revealed to be aziz and protected, and Allah used these people to protect His book. And that was the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so these were scattered efforts and scattered books, which were books of sciences of the Quran. And so what happened thereafter, and so this much I think is understood. There's a whole world, and so if you want to read up in the various books of this subject, they'll mention how who was the first man to write about hadiths in the Quran, and he wrote in this century, and this book, and then this book, and this book. Who was the first guy to write about grammar in the Quran was then this book, and this book. And so they have a whole documentation of the various books about the Quran, and the subject, and the authors throughout Islamic history in the first 3 or 4 centuries, and and so on. And then what happened next is then the Muslims got the idea later on in history, well, why don't we combine all these kinds of knowledges into one subject called Ulum al-Quran, or the knowledges of the Quran. And so what's the point of this subject? The point of this subject is to, if you like, summarize all the discussions that one must know about the Quran in a way that if one studies this one subject, one will get a good insight to what is discussed by all these other authors in Islamic history. It's quite a big goal if you think about it. It's a very ambitious aim that all these huge luminaries that talk about language in the Quran and hadiths, or how to approach hadiths with the Quran, principles of tafsir with the Quran, principles of deriving things from the Quran, how the Quran was preserved. All these various subjects and topics and discussions, they said, why don't we pull them together into one discipline, which will give one the keys to access all these other disciplines, to access the knowledges of the Quran. And this was the birth of Ulum al-Quran.